Thought I had a moderator, but I guess not. Good morning. How's everyone doing today? My name is Russell Asberg with EY, and I'm going to talk today about building out robust platforms and scalable platforms. So I'm a platform engineer at EY. Just a little bit about ourselves. We have about a team of right around almost 100 people. We have, let's see, off the top of my head, about 10 product managers, 3 system engineers, about 80 developers, 10 resources in the operations area, all supporting our platform. We also have product owners within the business, about 24 of them that participate in our overall landscape. So for an agenda area today, going to hit a couple of areas. So we've recently moved into Agile for our framework. So talk a little bit about what we've implemented in that and how we've scaled that out. We are definitely using distributed development, both within the teams that I mentioned and some outside teams. Some of our best practices from the testing arena and how we do deployments. So in terms of the landscape that we have, we are one of ServiceNow's top hosted instances in terms of size. We are currently supporting about 280,000 end users with about 12,000 licensed fulfillers on that platform. This slide actually does not represent our full picture. This is just our picture for our internal implementation. We also have an external implementation that has 3 production instances and I believe 9 non-production instances behind that on the external. One of those instances is a standard ITSM, while the other 2 instances are for hosting custom applications. From an internal standpoint, though, which is really where our bread and butter is at this point, been live just about 7 years now. All of the core ITSM processes, knowledge management, recently deployed financial management. We have HR, finance, shared service users. So the whole gamut of what ServiceNow has to offer. And you can just see here some of our yearly volumes. So lots of processes, lots of volume, and every one of these processes has activity going on a very regular basis. So talk first a little bit about Agile and how we've moved into it and how it's benefited us. EY is definitely has been a waterfall shop for a number of years. And about a year ago, our firm as a whole took on a mandate to start to move to Agile. We have been one of the early adopter teams to it. We're certainly not completely there yet, but we are probably one of the most successful. The way that we're running our Agile program is we do have 12-week PIs. Each of those 12 weeks are split into 6 2-week sprints. And we have 10 different Agile teams across those. Some of those teams, again, are on the internal side. Some of those are on the external side. So we do try to keep alignment of those teams. I think currently we have 7 teams working internally, 3 working externally. So as they move between the differing PIs and sprints, we do try to keep aligned internal, external work. We do currently have only 1 release train manager. That is starting to be looked at. We probably will start to split our trains because there's just too much to be incorporated into a single one. As I mentioned, we have 3 system engineers, and I'll be talking a little bit more when we talk about distributed teams, how those resources are very important for us to help maintain the consistency across all of our sprint teams. Obviously, each of these teams has some differing ways of working, different experience. So we depend on our system engineers to help ensure that those best practices are being followed and that we've got consistency across the platform. Prior to each of the 12-week PIs, there's actually a full-week PI planning session, multiple sessions, and this is all done virtually. So we do have pretty much resources across the globe that are participating in it. So it has brought up a number of challenges since we can't just take everyone and lock them in a room and let them hash out all of their priorities. So we do need the full week as opposed to just being able to do a couple of days all together. The way that typically happens is we will bring together usually about 80 people or so in about a 3 to 4 hour session on the first day for really everyone to present what they're trying to prioritize into that PI. And then there'll be breakout sessions out of that. So our different process owners will start to then work with their teams that have been assigned to them to identify risks, to identify their high-level sprint plan. Then we'll come back together on the last day, again, about a 4 hour session for everyone to present their plans, everyone to present their risks. So at the end of the day, we will have one consolidated list of risks. And that PI planning is certainly very important for us to allow those development teams to start to understand their work. That is the first time that our development teams will talk to the process owners. As we are bringing things into intake prior to that, it is only our system engineers and our product managers that have engagement with the process owners to do that high-level understanding of what they may be looking for. So this week of PI planning is important for the developers to really, get into the nitty-gritty of understanding. So our reasons for moving to Agile, well, first of all, of course, as I said, the firm itself mandated it, which kind of led us in the direction. However, that being said, as we have spent the last year in it, we have definitely seen a number of benefits of the Agile program over our traditional waterfall. There's no question that's allowed us to do more things at once. Granted, we had smaller teams in the past, but we would still only have 3, maybe 4 efforts going on at a single time. Now, as I said, we can easily have 10 concurrent paths. Some of those teams may be handling even 2 or 3 different things within a sprint. Within a PI. So overall, our PIs are usually averaging somewhere about on the order of about 25 different sets of updates. ServiceNow, of course, as the platform itself, definitely lends itself to those quick releases. One of the reasons why we're able to do it. One of the areas, as I said, that we're not strong with yet is minimal viable product. We see a lot of our sprints, then need another sprint, then need another sprint. And a lot of that is starting to move our business owners into understanding what MVP means. Again, many of them have 15, 20 years used to waterfall. So they haven't yet absorbed the concept of, yes, let's get something out, then improve on it. It's been a learning curve with them. Really, the only way we're finding is just experience. Convincing them that, nope, this is acceptable, let's move it out there, let's have teams start doing it. Those that we've convinced to, yes, put it out there and not have to wait for the whole thing, have definitely seen where it's benefited them to get the feedback from their user community. The smaller cycles has also given us a lot better success in terms of our testing at the end of cycles, obviously because of the shared components. It has allowed us to do things like break work between incident and problem and change separately. Where previously we would have a giant project around all of those running anywhere from 4 to 5 months. And moving in the Agile has allowed us to do very small cycles in each of them and get work out. Agile has also, although we're not fully there yet, has allowed us to move teams around a lot more and keep people's interest. In the past, we would see, 5 months, they'd be done saying, oh, great, I got to do this again, and we wind up losing people. With the very small work and the quickness of the teams, we quickly heard, this is great. I get much more experience. I get to work in ITFM one sprint and Portal the next sprint and CMDB the next sprint. So it's been great for morale of the team and knowing that they're just not going to be locked into one thing. That's the only thing they're going to get their experience on. So really, as you look to build your programs, you do want to make a very concerted effort and a very concerted decision point on which way to work. In our early days, we did have some projects that were waterfall and some that were agile, and trying to balance them at the same time just did not work well. So you really need to draw that line, say this is the way we're going to work. And also make sure that any partners you may be working with are doing that as well. One of the challenges that we do still face today is mainly with integrations, where our integration partner is still working and thinking in waterfall. We're thinking in agile, and it's caused a lot more start and stop on our side than necessarily on the vendor side. All right, so from our team organization, as I said, we currently right now have 10 development teams. We actually expect by the end of this year probably to be close to 15. And of those 10, 8 of them are what are called dedicated to our organization. So they are fully staffed, Scrum Master, Dev resources, testers, all part of our team. What we've also started to, I'll say, experiment with is a model where we supply the Scrum Master and we supply the tester, but we're letting other parts of the organization align developer resources into that. Success on that is still yet to be determined. The oversight is definitely there. We're seeing some difficulty in the skill levels because obviously they may not have as much training on the ServiceNow platform. They've also not necessarily been dedicated resources to it. So it's been a challenge at times to get them to understand our cadence and that we have to work within it. So it's a learning curve. I think we're going to get there, and I think we're going to see great success with that as we move forward. But again, if you're looking at that sort of solution, you do still need to make sure you've got that strong oversight. So whether it be the Scrum Master still fitting into the team or the system engineer oversight. So the 8 teams that I mentioned that we do have are also not sized the same. So all of our teams do have a Scrum Master. All of our teams do have testing resources. From a development team size, we have a few teams that are 2 resources, all the way up to, we have 1 team that has 5 development resources. So it has allowed us to right scale against the project work that we may be doing. Mentioned a moment ago, that career development. It's been great, especially the larger team, because it's allowed us to put a more junior level resource into the team, getting the benefit of the other resources, where sometimes a junior may struggle because they're not getting that support. Again, the third bullet point is actually talking about those distributed teams. So having that ability has allowed us just to have a lot more hands on keyboard. That's really our reason for that. We're not looking for our distributed teams to do that massively complex work. So they're not working in ITFM as an example. So those distributed teams are doing more like simple catalog items, simple workflows. We may let them start to expand a little bit more from that, but we're still not going to have them working in core spaces. It's more of very directed development areas. And the other thing that certainly this has brought forward is just more ideas being brought to the table. Taking the teams, having differing teams working on items. While at times we will look to keep teams engaged as a product may have its life cycle, we've actually made more of a concerted effort to switch teams up. Not necessarily within a PI, but from PI to PI. This way, again, we're getting differing thoughts, differing visions on that. It's been very successful as we've seen. Oh, why did we do it this way? Well, let's reset a little bit and have brought some really good ideas to the table by switching that up. That seems to be a little bit non-traditional, where a lot of the agile principles keep a team associated to a product. Right now, that seems to be working a little bit better for us. So that being said, though, there still are obviously a number of challenges that we have to work through. One is the core components. It's obviously very, very important to us that sprint planning and PI planning, that we are capturing what are we looking to do, and have a full set of tasks at the start of the sprint. Probably one of our top 3 struggle areas. Getting developers to plan what they want to do for the next 2 weeks and document that out. Not necessarily their favorite thing to do. We thankfully, knock on wood, haven't been caught too heavily yet on it. But it is something that we're continuing to push, looking for our system engineers to be able to do a task approval at the beginning of the sprint. We know we're never going to be 100%, but if we can get 80% of our tasks outlined on day 1 and then adjusted as the rest of the sprint goes, that's really where our goal is at this point. Regression testing. So we don't have strong regression testing scripts. Probably many would be in that same boat. It is something that we are starting to now put some concerted effort around, because really without it, you're dependent on that tribal knowledge of what didn't work in the past. We've had a lot of organizational change, and we've lost a lot of that knowledge. So ensuring that regression testing across the process areas, and I don't necessarily just mean I'll call it the easy across process areas. So it's easy to say we're going to make some changes in incident, and where we've got in problem to create an incident to double check that. Those are kind of the easy ones. Everyone's aware of those. It's more of that understanding where we may have global business rules against task, and understanding that if we make a change in those, we got to make sure that we test against the other task areas. Has been a struggle getting people to fully realize that. Again, more of just experience in that area. We've also looked very closely at what we're allowing our fully distributed teams to take on. The teams that we have are very eager and definitely want to learn and have some great overall skill sets. But that being said, their ServiceNow experience is very low. So some of the first projects that they took on were probably just too complex for them, and they wound up spinning a little bit, which caused them to just extend their sprints. So over the last, this current PI that we're in, we definitely took a much more closer look at the work that they were doing, and tried to even get that planned out prior to the overall PI planning cycle, so that we can ensure that skill set is there, and that they are prepared. As you may look at that, you're always going to get people saying, "Yes, I know it." We've even considered putting in some sort of validation or test of those resources. We haven't looked to actually implement that yet, but we are going to try to look closely at how do we, hate to use certify, but how do we ensure that those resources coming in a distributed manner may be ready to be able to work in it. So a few bullets as you build out teams. What do you want to allow your teams to do, based on that skill level? And certainly looking at the products that they're supporting. ITSM is an easy resource to get these days, but as you move into things like the portal, CSM, ITFM, that's where we're seeing not much of a market out there in terms of resources, and a very high level skill is needed in those areas. So certainly judge your resources and, again, kind of almost certify them against different products. How big do you want your teams to be? Again, you don't want the teams to be too big, because then you have people sitting around doing nothing, but certainly they can't be too small either. So it's very important, again, to have that understanding, what are we trying to accomplish, make sure everyone is on the same page with what we're trying to accomplish, and then right size those teams against it. So testing. So in all honesty, much of our testing to date has been manual in process. We have, for really the first 5.5 years of our life, if you will, depend very heavily on user acceptance testing. Usually our upgrades have been on the order of about 150 testers, all just coming in and banging on the system. It's a world we need to change. But it's not an easy world to change quickly. So we're trying to get that mapped out and put concerted effort against it. A few things that certainly have come up is, especially as we've moved into our sprint team model, our developers are very good at developing what is outlined and are very good at testing what they put together. Even their peers are very good at testing what their peer told them that they put together. Where they're not is what else is out there. The way that we've aligned our teams is to build exactly what's been documented, which has led to not necessarily seeing the full picture. So that's been one of our downfalls. As we've allowed teams to move between products, they may not have that full depth of product. One of the ways we're trying to combat that is trying to put together some, I'll call it standard negative testing, for teams to follow. Hasn't been of a great success yet. And I think we're kind of approaching it from a little bit too generalized of a standpoint. So we may be bringing that down to a product level, but starting to build it up that way. One important area is, if testing can't be completed, don't allow it to move forward. Probably our first PI, maybe even into our second PI and moving into Agile, testing on 90% of our sprints was the item that got dropped, because teams couldn't complete their work. They had overestimated. We allowed things to go into production and, needless to say, broke. So our position now is, if you outline that you've got 2 days of testing and you've got to cut into that, that sprint cannot go forward. Got some beef from the business on that, but I think they've seen where holding that hard line has been much more of a success, and not allowed for negativity to go into production. As you noticed earlier, our production instance is very, very big. We do have all of our non-production instances as exact clones of production. From a data standpoint, the only thing that's not the same is some of our back-end architecture in terms of replication. That has been very important to us. It has not necessarily been huge, delivery teams have not necessarily been huge fans of it, because it does slow them down a little bit. So for example, if they want to add something to the task table, it takes about 3 hours to do so. But that's what it's going to do in production as well. We want to make sure that as they're doing it in development, it's doing the same thing. We did have some teams that went off, used developer sites, threw some functionality together that took 2.1 seconds in order to run a transaction. And then they brought it into the actual environment and it went to 9 seconds. And of course, they were signing off on it on their developer site saying, hey, everything's good. And they even demoed it out there for the owners. So we have drawn a line that if you're doing anything for your owners, it has to be on our instances. And if it's slow in non-production, it's going to be slow in production. So as long as you can have those as close as possible, you know that what you're putting together will match up. And then certainly testing is not something that you can ever just draw a line in the sand and say we're done. Especially with, as I said, we've got 2-week sprints. You know that there's test scripts that are going to have to be updated after it. So we are looking to make sure that that team that is being built out is constantly going through scripts, saying which scripts do we need to adjust. So some discussion areas, what tools we use to perform testing. Honestly, we've not made a decision yet. We're looking at a few different tools right now. Each kind of have their pros and cons. The one tool that unfortunately is not getting great success thus far is ATF. That is more of, I think at this point, an experience level. We just don't have teams experienced in it. But it is something we've actually started working with ServiceNow to see, can we use ATF ourselves in order to build that out. Who would develop the test scripts? So early on in our cycle, we didn't have QA resources, and our developers were actually the ones building test scripts. Probably the worst resources to be developing the test scripts. Because they were just literally copying exactly what they were asked to implement. So we've tried to push that more back in the business right now until we can build out our QA teams. But we do want to get our QA resources having a totally independent view, especially from that negative area. Another piece of the PI planning that we do is also determining what type of testing we're going to do at the end of that each of those sprints. So as part of the PI planning cycle, they have to designate, are we looking at a full set of regression testing? So something like an upgrade obviously is a clear one. But I'll give another example. We've recently conducted a classification change across almost all task types. So incident, problem, change, all are adjusting how they classify tickets. We've mandated, that's a full regression test. You're going to impact, potentially everything. We're something like, creating one new catalog item. There's not going to be regression testing as long as that's, a standard workflow. So it is something we're capturing at that beginning of the PI and making sure we understand what resources we'll need. And then deciding on how of the many ways you want to test stuff. And this again is where our past experience of having our UA testers was great because we could have 150 people in the system and they would probably create an incident 140 different ways and we'd hit every possible scenario and never have a problem. Obviously, as you build out a QA team, that's not scalable. So understanding and really working with some of the business users on what do you do? What of the 10 different ways to create an incident, okay, what's the top 6? And make sure that those are being tested. And then talking about some of our deployment practices. So we are deploying, we actually are deploying almost every week. So even though we are on the 2-week cycles, what we'll see is sometimes it takes an extra week just for communications to go out. So probably we're easily 3 out of 4 weeks a month that we will have items that we are deploying. Every one of our deployments has a deployment plan to it, and where I say it is outlined to the minute, it is literally outlined to the minute. So as we do the non-production deployment, against a like-size environment, we will capture that timing for every step of the process. Even if that's 125 different update sets. We recently had one that large. We will have listed out, this one will take this long, this one will take this long, and especially with something that large, actually having breaks in there as well. So I think our 125 update set deployment had something about on the order of 7.5 hours of work, but also had built into it 3 hours worth of breaks. No one's going to just sit there and deploy update sets for 7 hours. So by having that, A, it does give you that buffer if something does get delayed at all, but B, again, it gives you more of that reality. Again, that deployment plan is built out from our dry run out of non-production. Where we've been challenged as we've moved into Agile is that deployment plan may not be created all at once. So previously with one big project, we were able to do one deployment plan and great, we were done. With Agile, lots of smaller pieces, we may be moving different ones of those into our staging environment at different times. So they each kind of have their own mini deployment plan, then rolling up into one. The other important thing about our deployment plans, it is that deployment plan has to have everything in it. Whether it be update sets, XMLs, manual steps, which clearly we want to avoid as much as possible. That's probably the biggest area that we've gotten burned. Is, oh yeah, I forgot, I did click that box and that didn't get picked up. So we want to make sure that there's no assumptions that anyone has made. If we're expecting someone to even open a file and review it, that is included in that those manual steps. So something that we used to do, we're not as successful now, is being able to have our non-production and production executed by the same resource. So it is our operations team that does do all of our non-prod deployments, but because they are 24/7 team, we can't always have it be the exact same resource doing those deployments. What that's led to is if we know it's not going to be, we want to make sure that every step of that deployment plan has all of those notes about what happened. So if there were 7 warnings and they reviewed them in non-prod and said they were all good, we capture that so that when it goes to prod, we make sure, well, we've got 7 warnings there as well. It was much easier when it was the same resource, as long as it wasn't weeks and weeks later that they were doing it. So it's the same resource, we still captured it, but you kind of have that fresh in your mind, you remember stuff. Without it being the same resource, again, it's led us to, you gotta have every little detail in there. Not necessarily an area of success for us, an area that we're from, is know what we're going to do if something fails prior to the deployment. We've recently actually just had a situation where we got to the end of the deployment, there was an issue in production that hadn't been picked up and test identified. Everyone went scrambling, actually didn't even talk to our business owner. Delivery team just started actually developing a fix, not just a fix, but actually developing new functionality. Pushed it out on a Sunday, but we didn't have security review everyone else involved in that conversation. So that kind of, I'll say, even drew a line in the sand for us of, we not only have to have the deployment plan, but we also have to have an agreement of, if something goes wrong, who are we informing, what are we doing? It may be a full back out. Thankfully, we rarely had to do that. But at least, okay, we know we're going to stop here, deactivate something. So we look to work that now into our procedures. The other big decision point, and our decision point on this, is our deployments are weekend deployments. We are 24/7, but we have chosen to do weekends because it's impacting the least amount of people. From functionality that it impacts, It actually does at times impact some pretty heavy areas because clearly weekends are usually more where change requests are. Fortunately, we don't have really any other great windows. We do allow a little bit during weekdays in the late US evening, but those are nothing more than very simple type items. I know some companies though that have chosen to do weekdays as opposed to weekends. So you really have to look at your business model and determine what is going to be that right window, and then make sure that everyone is aware of that's the timing for it. And then clearly, again, back to my other statement of what criteria must be met for deployment. Are we going to have all the testing? Also during our PI, where we'll look at, do we need to have security reviews? Do we need to have performance testing? All of that is determined at the start of our PI. All right, so 3 top takeaways, if you will. So plan and document that model. Make sure everyone is aware of it. And make sure that it's distributed out to not only all of your technical resources, but also all the business teams. Review that model on a regular basis. So again, back to the example of what are our windows. We always held very fast on, we just did weekend deployments. It's been about the last 4 to 6 months that we've allowed more flexibility into that daily. But there's still some days that we won't do it. So we've adjusted for that as we've seen business need. And probably lastly is have a plan for exceptions. As much as you have it documented down and say this is the mandate, this is the model, there's always going to be that situation where, hey, we've got this other project that could either stop us or cause us to move forward. So we've had situations where, yes, we were fully planned, we were ready to go, but because we suddenly had to do a security patch rolling out to 50,000 servers, we were asked, don't do anything that weekend. So we have to have that exception model in place, and that is also documented as part of our operate model. If we get an exception, who does it have to go to? Who does it have to be approved by? All right, with that, I'll take any questions. Yes? Mm-hmm. So the question is inside development teams and outside development teams. So whereas referring to inside development team is that's totally within our organization, meaning our ServiceNow support team. We've had the outside teams is more of an on-site services resource that wants to start learning some more, if you will. So they've got a day job in that arena, but maybe they want to start doing some development. So it's those types of resources that they're not part of our ServiceNow development teams. Yes? How do we keep developers from writing over each other's updates? It's not easy at times. That is where really our tasking has become much more important, and to understand and get them to understand, let's get that outlined in the beginning. The one thing that I didn't mention is we do have multiple sprint teams working within same environments. So it's a little bit easier with one sprint team because they're kind of all talking, but we've really kind of shown one of the reasons we need tasks is because you could have multiple teams working there. So it's really pushing that tasking, pushing that we have that in place to help avoid that. Has it totally stopped it? No. But thankfully, for the most part, it's been minimal in those areas where it has occurred. Yes?
Do you guys have analysts on your teams or persistent teams as well? I know you mentioned like 2 to 5 developers.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys also have QA analysts? Just do configuration?
So in terms of business analysts you're talking about?
Or systems, maybe configuration and ServiceNow, I guess it could be business analysts.
Right. So from a business analyst standpoint, it's actually been pushed back to the business to be supplying those. I will say it's been less than successful thus far. And the biggest reason is because our business hasn't been trained yet in doing that. So as we've moved into Agile, we've really removed that as a role from development teams. We still have some on a plate. Unfortunately, our product managers have had to take on that role, as opposed to our product managers working to build out roadmaps. That's where we want to get them. But our intent is that the business is going to be the one that supplies the actual analysts in detailed level, outlining of what they're looking for. Yes?
Two-part question. Given your large deployment, has ServiceNow provided you any special considerations to be able to scale and perform well across the globe? That's question one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, question two, data privacy issues, right? How does that affect your plan going forward?
Sure. So for those in here, two questions. First one is, what has ServiceNow done for us because of size? I will say a lot. And I think there's someone else in the audience that also has had a lot of J&J is a very similar boat to us. So as we have grown, I will say, unfortunately, ServiceNow has been much more reactive versus proactive in terms of some of the things we've put in place. So we do have, from an infrastructure standpoint, we have multiple read replicas to help split our load on the system. And we also have recently moved to database shards. So we actually have two primary databases at this point. Very simply put, one has attachment data, audit data, one has everything else. Second item, the sharding was strictly because of hardware size. We were approaching, at that point in time, 10 terabytes, and just the hardware wouldn't support it. So those are probably the two biggest things that ServiceNow has had to do for us. I think other things like ramping up application nodes, things like that, are pretty much a given that they do for everybody. Second question is around data privacy. That's really been more of a business challenge in order to put those requirements in place. We've certainly had to do some best practices around it out to our developers. But really, we try not to mess with that security model in just an individual sprint. If someone's coming and wants to do something that's going to be across the platform, that will really become, very large type of sprint, bringing all security and architecture and teams together like that in order to put that together. Any other questions? Okay.
Does each jet team do their own deployment plan, or is there one deployment plan for all 10?
So the question is each sprint team had their own deployment plan? So yes, what winds up happening is the sprint team will put together what they need. That gets fed into our operations team, and then that gets pulled together into one master deployment plan. What we have been successful with thus far is when we do have those, they've all been sequential. So we do try to avoid doing anything in parallel. Obviously, you never want to deploy two update sets anyway at the same time, but we have been very successful in saying this one, then this one, then this one, then this one. And that's even any sort of back end. So if we're doing, we may work with ServiceNow recently to reduce some indexes, that will even be worked into it. So we won't go parallel with anything wherever possible. Yes?
What's the roles of your system engineers?
Yep. So our system engineers are really tasked with a few different areas. One, from the development arena, is reviewing that tasks that have been developed and ensuring that there's no conflicts, ensuring that they're aligning to best practices. Our system engineers are also an approval. So if somebody wants to add a new field into the system, that requires system engineering approval. System engineers are actually involved prior to deployment as well. I had mentioned earlier that from a PI planning, the first time our developers meet with the business owners is during that PI planning. System engineers are actually the ones that review intake and give the high-level sprint estimates. from that. And then finally, our system engineers have a role on the backside. So when something goes out into operations, if there's a failure in that, it is the system engineers that become engaged, because obviously those sprint teams may be off on a totally different project at that point. So they need to have that understanding of what was implemented so that they can be, I'll call it that first level of support if operations is not able to address. Yes?
Have you guys experimented with combining operations and development?
So have we looked at really any DevOps type areas? Not all that much. Only very, very simplistic tasks. Have we looked to do that? And that's more of, okay, it's already an operational type tasks that we're allowing some dev type work to be done in. But anything that's a total new build or anything like that, not an area that we're looking at this point. Yes?
Are you using ServiceNow for your Agile task management or something else?
We are not. We're using TFS. Our preference would clearly be use ServiceNow. Unfortunately, it's a firm decision that chose to go TFS. All right. Well, thanks everyone for your time today. Please do complete the survey that's through the app, and have a great day, everyone.